On October 17th, 1781, the British surrendered at Yorktown. But the quiet that followed was not peace. Trunks left in Charleston, a letter sealed and never opened. To the General, when it is over. It never reached Washington. What else was erased with the ash? Velvet drapes hung in unused halls, a quill beside parchment untouched, a trunk disappeared from record. Between 1781 and 1784, governors fled, estates burned, and loyalist gold was lost. The treaty was signed, but some ledgers were struck through in red. When independence was declared, what else was left unspoken? Welcome to history's ledger. The revolution did not end with cheers at Yorktown. It ended in silence. Letters sealed but never opened. Trunks lifted onto ships that vanished. Ledgers struck through in red. Between 1781 and 1784, governors fled in the night, estates burned, and debts pulled harder than chains. Treaties were signed far from the crowds, in rooms where only wax seals heard the words. And at home, celebration rooms stood empty, velvet curtains gathering dust, crystal glasses never lifted. This is not the story of victory secured, but of survival nearly lost. A republic born in hunger, debt, and doubt. Its future balanced on parchment more fragile than any sword. So let us turn the page together. Let us step into the uneasy silence that followed Yorktown and see how close America came to collapsing after it had already won. Yorktown fell silent on October 17th, 1781. Drums ceased, smoke thinned, surrender terms carried on paper still damp with ink. In London, the Prime Minister whispered, "Oh God, it's all over." But peace did not follow. In Charleston the next spring, loyalist houses stood half-stripped, mahogany under dust sheets, porcelain cups stacked hastily, one cracked, a ceremonial sword delivered too late, forgotten in a drawer. At the foot of a bed, a trunk held linens, a child's coat, and an envelope sealed in red wax. To the General, when it is over. The seal was never broken. Governor Sir James Wright fled Georgia in 1782. The harbor smelled of tar and pitch. Rigging creaked as trunks and crates were hauled aboard. Ships sailed for New York, Florida, the Indies. One never arrived. Its trunks were never reclaimed. In New York, the British lingered until November 1783. As a last act, they nailed their flag to a greased pole. John Van Arsdale climbed it, hands smeared with ash, and tore it down as the American flag rose. Bells pealed. That same week, a warehouse near Wall Street burned. A ledger inside said to list loyalist gold, blackened to ash. Treaties were signed far from the crowds. In Paris, Franklin, Adams, and Jay sat in coal-warmed rooms at the Hotel de York. No trumpets, only clerks blotting signatures and folding parchment. Ratifications passed in silence in May 1784. Parchment exchanged for parchment, wax for wax. At home, Victory exposed fractures. In Connecticut, a hall was set for celebration. Red velvet drapes, crystal glasses, a guest list written in ink. No one came. The room was boarded up, later erased from plans as if it never existed. In Massachusetts, debts mounted. Veterans returned to mortgaged farms, taxmen at the door. In taverns smelling of rum and damp wool, farmers muttered, "We fought for liberty, not liens." Within years, their voices would echo as musket fire in courthouse yards. Washington, by lamplight, in rooms smelling of tallow and paper, wrote letters before resigning his commission that December. The sealed envelope from Charleston never reached him. Somewhere its wax cracked, its page curling inward, unread. The war had ended. The ledgers had not. In New York, a clerk struck through a loyalist account in red. In London, a banker paused at a colonial debt that would never pay. In Philadelphia, a delegate whispered, "We have a peace." His companion replied, "We have a problem." Outdoors, nails hammered shutters back on. Indoors, quills waited beside inkwells unopened. Velvet drapes gathered dust. Somewhere in ash, a ledger that might have explained everything lay in fragments too small to read. What else disappeared between cheers and signatures? Which names were crossed out in red, and why? Dawn rose over Charleston Harbor in the spring of 1782, the air thick with salt, tar, and the rancor of hemp. Wharves groaned with departures, bales lashed tight, trunks stacked high, crates marked with faded insignia. Rigging creaked, gulls shrieked, children clutched mothers' hands as loyalist convoys prepared to sail. Inside a meeting street townhouse, rooms bore the marks of haste. A mahogany sideboard pulled from its wall, porcelain teacups packed in straw, one cracked at the lip. Velvet drapes hung limp over a parlor no one would sit in again. In a drawer lay a ceremonial sword, delivered too late to matter. On a bed, 3 trunks waited, one blue, one green, one plain. The blue held linens folded neat. The green contained ledgers, one page slashed through in red so hard the nib tore parchment. The plain was shut, its clasp warmed by a thumb that hesitated. Beneath cloth inside lay a satin-wrapped bundle and a letter sealed in red wax. To the general, when it is over. The trunk was lifted without being opened. Down at the docks, Sir James Wright's convoy gathered. Clerks scrawled manifests in cramped hands, sealing wax pressed with rings, soon to lose meaning. The air smelled of pitch and pine. Sailors shouted. Children stared at the horizon. Some ships turned north to New York, others south or east. One was never seen again. Luxury lingered even as the city emptied. A pair of crystal flutes on a sideboard, one still marked with a ring of wine. A guest list pinned to a mantle, the flourish unfinished. A banquet table left laid with porcelain and knives as straight as oaths. Beeswax candles gone cold. Celebration had been prepared and abandoned. The convoy departed. 2 trunks were accounted for, the blue and the green. The plain trunk, clasp warmed and letter sealed, never appeared on any manifest. By evening, the harbour smelled of rain. Upstairs in the empty townhouse, drapes shifted in the draught like lungs. On the floor, a dark mark flattened the rug where the plain trunk had been. Some losses are louder in silence than in battle. A trunk lifted, then erased. A letter sealed but never delivered. A ledger struck through until ink tore parchment. What could it have said? Confession, account, plea, or only goodbye? New York, November 25th, 1783. Frost rimed the cobbles. Smoke from kitchen chimneys hung low. Along the Battery, the last British boats pulled away, oars cutting the harbour in clean strokes. Rigging rattled like bones. The city smelled of tar, wet rope, and departure. As a parting insult, the Union flag was nailed high on a greased pole. A crowd gathered, silent, watching. John Van Arsdale, a young seaman, smeared ash on his palms, wrapped a sash, and climbed. Inch by inch, he worked upward, pressed his cheek to the timber, hammered nails free, and tore the flag loose. The American banner rose. The crowd shouted, warmth breaking through the cold. Evacuation day. The ships carried more than soldiers. Loyalist families crowded decks, trunks stacked tight. Some were enslaved people promised freedom by redcoats. Faces turned to the horizon. Names were scribbled in ledgers, then closed with a snap no one ashore could hear. In the city, luxury and absence mingled. Parlors gleamed with damask curtains and tables laid with crystal, but many stood unused. A Pearl Street mansion's long table still set with wine glasses chimed faintly in the draft. Down by Wall Street, a warehouse burned. When the beams collapsed, a ledger was said to have gone with them. Records of deposits and pledges, names and gold. Ash leveled every number. On Broadway, shops reopened. Bolts of dyed cloth smelling of copper. Shoemakers leaning on laths. In Trinity Churchyard, brittle grass crunched beneath mourners' boots as fingers traced names carved carefully into stone. Washington entered before noon, boots whitening with frost. Hooves on stone were music enough. In upstairs windows, mirrors reflected the procession, doubling it, as if the city needed reassurance it was real. In a hall off Queen Street, a quill lay beside a blank page, an inkwell still sealed. "Will it hold?" a man asked softly. "It must," came the reply, eyes fixed not on officers, but on carpenters already measuring door frames. Luxury lingered, a beaver hat abandoned on a chair, a gilt frame missing its painting, candlesticks flanking dust where a clock had been. Farther south, a man stood by the slip, a trunk at his feet, a key in his palm that fit nothing now. Watching sails vanish, he murmured, "It's all over," and did not say for whom. The treaties had been signed in Paris a year earlier, in quiet rooms warmed by coal and sealing wax. The final ratifications would be exchanged in 1784, parchment for parchment. But here, on Evacuation Day, the city itself held its reckoning. Ash in a warehouse, silence in a parlor, a flag snapping above a pole, scrubbed clean of grease. What else left the harbor besides men in red? Which letters stayed folded in trunks never opened? Which ledgers turned to rumor when fire blackened their pages? The harbor kept breathing. Ships shrank to pinpricks. The flag cracked in the wind, like a page turned but not yet read. The Hotel de York stood on a narrow Paris street, shutters drawn against fog. Coal smoke clung to stone. Inside, the air was thick with tallow and damp wool. Independence was not won in cheers, but in quills scratching, wax dripping, chairs sliding on wood. On November 30th, 1782, Benjamin Franklin, John Adams, and John Jay met British envoy Richard Oswald. No anthems, only parchment laid flat, signatures drying under sand. Outside, carts rattled over cobblestones, Parisians unaware history was shifting an ocean away. A single fireplace hissed. Franklin paused mid-line. Adams pressed each letter upright. Jay set his seal. Few words passed. Yet this was the moment Britain acknowledged a nation. No cannon, only whispers. By January 1784, Congress ratified in Annapolis. Britain followed in April. On May 12th, ratifications exchanged again in Paris. Clerks unrolled parchment, compared seals, nodded, folded, tied. Minutes, not fanfare, secured recognition. But recognition in ink did not equal stability. The Articles of Confederation were weak, soldiers unpaid, farmers dispossessed, merchants facing paper no one trusted. Paris offered peace, at home, disarray. Objects showed the contrast. In French salons, crystal glasses rang, silk banners draped, harpsichords played. In Massachusetts, veterans came home to fields mortgaged twice, courts demanding payment, taverns filled with mutters, crystal in Paris, red ink in Boston. History remembers the treaty as triumph, but parchment is fragile. Could signatures outlast hunger, debt, and rebellion? Would wax hold longer than silence? Connecticut, spring, 1783. A stately house stood on a hill, shutters white, cart ruts deep in mud. Inside, servants had prepared for a celebration that never came. The parlor smelled of beeswax and starch. Crimson velvet drapes hung across tall windows. A long table stretched beneath a glittering chandelier, silver forks aligned, crystal glasses placed so carefully a whisper might have tipped them. On the mantel, a guest list lay folded, its letters curled like lace. No guests arrived. Rumors clouded peace. The British might not leave New York. Debts might bind tighter than chains. So the chairs sat empty, the glasses filmed with dust, the drapes gathering silence. Weeks passed. The guest list yellowed, the chandelier dulled, the tablecloth stained. When carpenters remodeled decades later, the room was boarded over, erased from plans as if it had never been. How many other rooms lingered unseen, dressed for triumph, abandoned in doubt? History records victory. Objects told another story. A polished spoon that never touched lips, a crystal flute that never rang, a velvet chair where no one sat. Which speaks louder, the treaty signed in Paris or the untouched table in Connecticut? The war had ended. But even in wealth, celebration curdled into silence. Philadelphia, 1784. A merchant leaned across his counter, the air thick with leather and damp wool. Coins clinked. Massachusetts paper, New York copper, Virginia script. None held equal worth, none trusted beyond its border. He stacked them, frowned, pushed them away. The Articles of Confederation bound 13 states loosely, rope tied too slack. Congress could declare war, but not levy tax. It asked for funds. States sent little or nothing. Soldiers went unpaid. Farmers faced courts and foreclosure. Merchants dealt in paper no one trusted. In counting houses, ledgers refused to balance. Ink tallied debts. Red strokes struck out names of men fled west. One clerk held his quill above the page and whispered, "Who will make good?" Only rats, scratching under the floor, replied. Yet parlors glittered with fragile luxury. Chandeliers burned whale oil, Madeira glowed in cut glass, families dined with silver forks from London. But what use is crystal when wages are unpaid? What worth silver if no one trusts the coin in hand? Trade faltered. A wagon from Pennsylvania rattled toward New Jersey, only to be taxed at the border as if it had crossed into another country. Horses steamed, drivers cursed, flour spoiled in barrels. The articles were meant as framework. Instead, they were walls with gaps wide enough for wind to walk through. Imagine being a veteran of Saratoga, musket above the hearth, still smelling of powder. Yet your land was seized for unpaid debts, sheriff's boots muddy on your threshold. Did victory mean this? Liberty measured in liens and summons? In taverns, candles guttered as men bent over mugs of sour ale. Voices low, tempers high. Some muttered reform, others revolt. The air smelled of smoke, beer, frustration. Paris parchment promised peace, but the reality smelled of stale ink and anger fermenting like sour wine. Would stronger chains hold the Republic together or strangle it? Western Massachusetts, summer, 1786. Soil heavy with rain, furrows clinging. A farmer lifted his plow, wood smooth from years, but the sheriff already stood in mud, warrant in hand. The smell of wet earth hung between them. He was not alone. Veterans who had fought at Saratoga and Yorktown returned to farms now pressed by liens. Their muskets still hung above hearths, iron faint with powder's tang. They had bled for liberty, but courts took their land. In Springfield, debt notices fluttered across courthouse steps. Veterans stood in rough wool, caps in hand, while inside, lawyers bent over vellum, a crystal decanter of brandy on the table. Outside, farmers muttered their lives were weighed against imported drink. Daniel Shays, veteran of Bunker Hill and Saratoga, carried not a musket but a petition. Names signed in cramped hands, ink smudged with sweat. Judges dismissed it. The crowd pressed closer, voices low and taut, like thunder still out of sight. Stories spread, farmers burying tools to keep them from seizure, ledgers hidden in cellars. A silver watch passed as collateral and never reclaimed. Mystery lingered in absences. Which debts were erased by fire? Which names struck out in secret? Taverns thick with smoke and sour ale carried sharper talk. Pewter mugs slammed wood in rhythm. We bled for freedom, one man said, and now we pay in chains. The rafters held the words long after men left. Luxury lingered in Boston parlors. Officers dined from porcelain, spoons engraved in silver. Farmers patched coats, yet some kept lace handkerchiefs folded from before the war. Fragments of gentleness amid hardship. Which was remembered more, hunger or the token of grace? By autumn, anger hardened. Court sessions were blocked, doors barred, judges sent home. Shays and thousands marched toward Springfield, muskets shouldered, breath rising in frozen air. They marched not for conquest, but relief. Yet every musket echoed the revolution itself. The air smelled of wood smoke, damp wool, and hunger. On one side, veterans demanding justice. On the other, a government that seemed too close to the one they had cast off. Would the republic endure or collapse under debts of its own making? January 1787. Roads froze hard, ruts sharp, air bitter enough to split wood. Veterans trudged through crusted snow, patched coats stiff with frost, rope for belts, blankets cut into sleeves. Muskets lay across shoulders, barrels so cold they burned through gloves. At their head, Daniel Shays, once praised at Saratoga, now leading men with nothing but anger. Their breath hung white, step after step, toward the Springfield arsenal. Inside town, another sound. Militia boots on wooden floors, bayonets stacked by doors. Governor Bowdoin had raised them with merchant money. Their muskets gleamed with fresh oil, uniforms sharp with new wool. One side marched with hunger, the other with polished steel. Mystery clung to the winter march. Which page would history keep? Petitions folded in pockets, receipts for debts unpaid, or love letters worn soft in coats? When gunfire came, which of those scraps would survive? The arsenal loomed, brick rimed with frost. Cannon waited behind its gates, muzzles iced. Farmers drew close, boots slipping, voices raw, We want justice. The words echoed along the frozen road, then shots cracked, powder smoke rose. Men staggered, some fell. The rebellion broke on the arsenal walls, not by foreign bayonets, but by their own neighbors. The smell of powder drifted in silence heavy as snow, and in that silence the question lingered. What kind of liberty jails its veterans? What kind of republic fires on men who once carried its banner? Springfield held its arsenal. The rebellion failed, yet its mark endured, not in victory, but in the knowledge that the republic's foundations trembled. The smoke at Springfield had barely lifted before warrants were nailed to tavern doors, names written in a clerk's tilted hand, paper smelling of lamp oil and damp wool. Men folded the notices into pockets once used for petitions. Daniel Shays slipped north across frozen fields into Vermont. He carried no banner now, only the weight of a name whispered in kitchens and courtrooms. He's gone, someone said, as if saying it erased the debt. In Boston, Governor Bowdoin walked echoing halls. He had raised a militia with merchant gold, but when elections came, those same merchants turned. His name was struck from ballots like a verdict. In back rooms, men bent over maps, linen cuffs brushing candle stubs. If courts can be closed, one said, tapping Springfield. If ledgers can be ignored, property is rumor. Shadows flickered across words like bonds and titles. Outside, sleigh bells jingled faintly, as if nothing had broken. Mystery threaded the thaw. Tax rolls vanished from two towns. Meeting minutes turned up torn, tied with twine. In a tavern attic, broadsides lay scorched at the edges, unsigned. Who wrote them? Who hid them? Dust carried questions ink never answered. Philadelphia merchants hesitated mid-figure, pens scratching the same doubt into ledgers from Charleston to New York. Could a contract mean anything if a drum could close a court? The articles sat on a shelf smelling of damp, paper without power. By May 1787, carriages rattled into Philadelphia, trunks thumping, windows nailed shut against listeners. The air thickened with wool, wax, and secrecy. Delegates feared not the roar of war, but the silence of courts gone dark and veterans turning from ballots to muskets. Luxury flickered inside, a silver inkwell cooled to the touch, a bone-handled paper knife slicing seals, a pocket watch ticking loud against the hush. Outside, a boy sold lemonade from a blue glazed jug, his eyes on a door that never opened. And Shays? He waited. Time dulled his rebellion into warning. Not victory, not crime, but a march that showed how thin the Republic's walls had become. What did America learn that winter? That paper isn't power until trusted. That debt can fell a farmer faster than bayonets. That silence more than battle could break a republic. May 1787. Philadelphia woke to damp streets, carriages rattling toward the State House. Inside, shutters were nailed tight, air thick with wax and wool. The future of the Republic was asked to whisper. Green baize covered tables. Quills and sand shakers lay in neat ranks. At the center sat a silver inkstand, cool and heavy. Washington took the chair. Franklin was carried in. Madison opened a notebook already crowded with notes. No speeches for crowds. There was no gallery. The fear was simple. If courts could be silenced in winter, if debts ignored by mobs, if contracts torn, what kept the roof from falling? Shay's march had left snow on the chamber floor. Plans collided. Some called for 2 chambers by population, others for states equal. The Connecticut Compromise held the room together. Other bargains cut deeper. How to count those in chains? A fraction was written where a person should have been. The line stayed, bitter as smoke. Secrecy ruled. Drafts were folded and burned, letters rewritten into harmless chatter. One messenger's parcel left sealed, returned sealed, its wax stamped deeper than before. No explanation given. Luxury framed the labor. A cane with the silver head leaned on a chair. A beaver hat rested neatly on a sill. A decanter of claret stood untouched by the hearth until the hall cleared. Even these objects felt like props in a play with no certain script. Afternoons grew stifling. Linen stuck to spines. Tempers rose with the heat. A thunderstorm cracked over the Delaware, lightning flaring white across parchment. Hands jumped, ink blotted. By September, the Constitution lay complete, parchment heavy, letters sanded dark. On the 17th, Washington signed first, Franklin with a wry flourish. Others followed, bold or cramped, north to south. Outside, the sun slid along brick as if nothing had happened. The Republic was bound, but not secured. Some would call it strength, others, chains. So I'll ask you, what do you think? Was this parchment salvation, or only another silence waiting to break? Tell me in the comments below. And if this story carried you, don't forget to like this video and subscribe, so we can keep turning the pages of history's ledger together. The page itself seemed to breathe. Parchment heavy with signatures lay on the table, the ink dark and still damp at the edges. Sand scattered across it caught the light like fine grit in a riverbed. Men had left the hall, but the paper stayed, cooling under shutters nailed against the street. Outside, not everyone was ready to bow to what had been written. In taverns along the wharves, voices carried over sour ale and smoke. Some called the new Constitution too sharp, power sharpened at the center, states blunted at the edges. Others swore it was the only roof strong enough to keep winter from coming again. The rafters creaked under those arguments, the smell of tar and boiled meat rising through the boards. Printed broadsides appeared, essays under the name Publius argued for strength, for unity, for a spine made of more than paper. Hamilton wrote with precision, Madison with patience, Jay with the clipped calm of a jurist. But for every page they inked, there were replies unsigned, hidden in desk drawers or burned in hearths before dawn. Mystery lingers in those absences. Letters once folded, names never revealed. Whose words might have tipped the balance if they had survived? Luxury clashed with anger in the streets. In parlors, imported Madeira was poured into crystal, the glass catching firelight as debates simmered below. In Massachusetts, veterans who had marched behind shays leaned on plows in fields of stony soil, debts still pressing, hands raw. Which picture was truer, the glass raised in toast, or the hand that trembled from hunger? The Federalists filled the presses, their arguments pressed in bold type, stacked in neat piles that smelled of ink and lamp oil. Anti-Federalists filled the air with suspicion, whispers of power concentrated, of rights not written, of liberty exchanged too quickly for order. At one gathering, a man leaned close to his neighbor and muttered, "Freedom dies quiet, not loud." His words, never printed, lived only in the memory of a listener who left the room uneasy. Questions crept in. What rights had been promised? What protections left unnamed? Could parchment bind without an oath of liberties? The answer, finally, was an addition. 10 amendments, carved like stitches over a wound, promised speech, worship, petition, arms, guardrails against silence. Some believed it was enough. Some doubted. All understood it was the only way forward. The parchment in Philadelphia carried the signatures, but the voices outside carried the uncertainty. And uncertainty leaves its own trace. Scraps of letters unsigned, broadsides scorched, whispers in taverns that no clerk recorded. What is more binding in the end? Ink on a page, or the memory of words erased before they were spoken aloud? A bell tolled, slow, deliberate, heavy. Its echo rolled down narrow streets, brushing brick walls and rattling shop shutters. Men paused mid-step, hands on door frames, listening. It was not a church service. It was not an alarm. It was a summons, an invitation to cast the first votes of a nation still unsure of itself. In taverns, the sound mingled with the scrape of chairs and the low murmur of wages. Could Washington refuse? Would Adams settle for less than the highest place? Names were spoken over mugs of ale, foam dripping onto scarred tables that smelled of stale beer and pine pitch. Outside, horses stamped and snorted, their breath frosting in the dawn. The election of 1789 was unlike any before it. Ballots were slips folded by candlelight, hands shaking as they pressed wax to seal them. Only property owners could vote, their boots tracking mud across polished floors in courthouses where clerks waited with ledgers open. Each page absorbed not only ink, but the weight of hesitation. What if this failed? What if the Republic stumbled before it learned to walk? Luxury flickered in the margins. Some voters arrived in coats lined with fox fur, their gloves stitched in Paris, their canes tipped with silver. Others came in patched wool, sleeves stiff with frost, muskets leaning by the door like mute companions. They all reached for the same quill, its feather dark with ink, its nib worn by too many hands. Whispers ran ahead of the ballots. Washington would be chosen. He had to be. His name was not written, it was assumed, carried like breath. In parlors, women poured tea into porcelain cups, painted with vines, listening at doors for news. In the streets, children repeated the general's name as if it were a rhyme, unaware that the Republic's fate might rest on the silence of those same letters. Yet even in certainty, tension lingered. What if factions hardened? What if the man second chosen, meant for vice, carried a grudge instead of duty? In the margin of one ledger, a clerk wrote the tally and then drew a small, nervous flourish beside Washington's name as if to bless it against dispute. When the results were declared unanimous, the sound was not thunder, but applause muffled by relief. No torches in the night, no gunpowder lit in streets, just nods, handshake, shoulders eased, as if men had been holding their breath since Yorktown and had finally exhaled. And yet, mystery still walked between the lines. Letters sent by couriers never reached their destinations. Some ballots vanished in transit, names missing from tallies. Did they change the outcome? Number. But absence leaves its own imprint, a hollow in the archive where certainty should have stood. Washington would take his oath in April, standing beneath a sky streaked with gray. The crowd pressed close, the air smelling of horses and smoke. His hand would rest on a Bible edged with gilt. The words he spoke would not be long, but they would echo far. Still, a question remained, one whispered in the crowd that day. Could one man's virtue hold back ambition? Could ink on parchment outlast hunger, anger, or silence? The bell tolled again, its voice steady above the murmurs, reminding the city that the vote was done, but the reckoning had only begun. A tall pole, scarred by nails, stood on the common long after the crowd had gone. Children pointed to it as their parents told the story, how British soldiers had greased it to keep the Union flag aloft, and how John Van Arsdale, ash smeared on his hands, climbed until he tore the nails free. For years afterward, on Evacuation Day, the climb was performed again, a ritual of defiance and pride. Picture the scene. November air sharp with smoke from hearth fires, church bells carrying thinly through the harbor fog, the smell of roasted chestnuts mingling with coal soot. Boys scrambled up the pole as the crowd held its breath. Women in wool cloaks stood shoulder to shoulder, shawls bright with embroidery passed down from before the war. On a nearby table, glasses of mulled wine steamed, cinnamon sharp in the cold air. For a moment, celebration carried the city. The flag snapped high, the crowd cheered, and the sound rebounded off brick facades along Broadway. Drummers beat cadences that rattled the shutters. Fifes keened above them, the noise spilling like light into alleys still scarred by war. But memory is fragile. By the 1790s, Evacuation Day was fading. New festivals pressed against the calendar. The pole stood weathered, its wood splitting, where rain had soaked through, its story told in smaller circles, then whispered, then not told at all. Some objects outlasted the words. A silver cup, engraved with the date, was found in a pawn shop, its rim dented, initials rubbed thin. A banner sewn for a procession in 1784 lay folded in an attic trunk, the silk cracked along the creases. A diary page, smudged with wine, recorded the climb in a hand that shook with age. The flag replaced, the crowd near wept. After that line, nothing more. And there were mysteries that clung to the celebration's shadow. A warehouse ledger said to contain Loyalist deposits burned the same week, its pages curling black in the smoke. No one claimed the gold listed there. Was it hidden before the fire? Was it carried quietly onto a departing ship? Or was the story itself another invention, meant to explain wealth that changed hands without witness? Questions linger in absence. Why did a nation born in triumph let the day of its cleansing victory wither? Was it embarrassment at the years of weakness that followed, or the recognition that parades could not hide the cracks in its foundation? The pole, once greased to deny a flag, became nothing more than wood, left to weather and splinter. By the time it was gone, the ritual had vanished with it. Only fragments remained, cups, banners, notes, each whispering a moment of pride, swallowed by silence. What lasts longer, the cheer of a crowd, or the empty space where it once stood? On a shelf in a counting house near Wall Street, a ledger lay warped by heat. Its spine was split, its cover blackened, its corners curled. Inside, numbers marched down the pages in neat columns. Debts owed, payments pledged, balances carried over. Then the ink stopped. The final entries were smudged into ash. Some said it recorded Loyalist deposits, gold hidden before departure, fortunes meant to return when tempers cooled. Others whispered it held the names of merchants who had quietly shifted allegiances, selling to both sides until the last redcoat left the harbor. The fire that consumed it came suddenly, sweeping the building in 1783, leaving only fragments. A clerk's quill was found fused to the desk where he had left it. The rest was silence. What truths had been struck through that day? Which debts were erased by accident and which by design? In the city above those ashes, wealth was still displayed. Velvet drapes framed parlor windows, porcelain cups, their rims gilt, clinked faintly as tea was poured again, though the leaves came by new routes. Silver candlesticks gleamed on tables where arguments smoldered. Should creditors be repaid in full? Should loyalists reclaim estates they had abandoned? The glow of the metal only deepened the shadows of distrust. Outside, veterans leaned against tavern walls, coats frayed, boots split at the seams. They spoke in low tones of wages still unpaid, of taxes too sharp, of courts that summoned them without mercy. The smell of tobacco and sour ale carried their discontent into the street. Luxury and hunger shared the same city blocks. A coach lined in velvet rattled past a group of men who had marched at Yorktown. Its wheels splashed mud onto trousers patched 3 times already. The passengers inside did not look out, and the ledger, its ashes were swept into a corner and forgotten, but the questions it left behind refused to fade. Was the fire an accident, sparked by a tipped lamp? Or was it a cleansing, deliberate as any page struck through in red? History keeps the treaties and the speeches, but it is the missing accounts that hold our attention, the spaces where numbers stop, the corners where fire licked too neatly. Which is more powerful, the records we can still read, or the ones someone ensured we never could? He placed the parchment on the table and bowed. No flourish, no crown, no sword raised above his head. Only a man surrendering power he could have kept. The chamber in Annapolis was cold that December evening. Frost clouded the window panes, and the smell of tallow clung to the air. Delegates leaned forward, some blinking against tears, others silent with disbelief. Washington's hand rested on the folded document, his resignation, while his uniform, worn smooth from years of service, caught what little light the candles offered. Around him, the trappings of authority stood ready. A ceremonial sword lay sheathed against the wall. A chair carved in mahogany waited at the head of the room. A silver inkstand, polished bright, gleamed under the flicker of flame. He ignored them all. "I retire," he said simply, his voice steady, the words carried on the hush of men who knew they were witnessing something rare. No monarch stepping down under force, no general grasping at rule, a soldier walking away. Outside, snow muffled the city streets. Hooves struck softly on frozen earth, bells clinking faintly from harnesses. No parade followed him, no trumpets marked his departure. He left as he had entered, quietly, with duty worn more heavily than medals. What other republic had seen such a thing? Which man before him had laid aside command when victory placed power within reach? The gesture itself became the answer, copied in diaries, recalled in whispers, carried as legend across oceans. Washington returned to Mount Vernon, to halls scented with cedar and smoke, to fields brittle under winter sky. The sword was stored, the uniform hung. At his desk, quills waited beside parchment, one letter opened, another still sealed. Visitors later claimed that even in silence, the room felt full. Chairs too carefully aligned, books arranged as if to remind him that order was a republic's truest wealth. Mystery endures in that moment. Did he believe the nation could survive without him? Did he know he would be called back again, chosen not by armies but by ballots? Or was the gesture only faith, that laying down power would teach others to do the same? The ink on his resignation dried long ago, but the gesture remains. The hills of western Massachusetts lay bare after harvest, stone walls cutting across frozen ground, barns standing silent against the wind. Farms that had once fed regiments now sagged beneath unpaid taxes. Notices nailed to doors curled in the cold, ink faded, names scrawled with an unfeeling hand. Inside one farmhouse, the air smelled of damp straw and wood smoke. A veteran sat at the table, his musket above the hearth, its lock still dark with the stain of powder. He had marched to Saratoga, watched Cornwallis surrender, returned expecting liberty. Instead, creditors came first, demanding payment in coin he had never seen, not the paper wages he carried in his coat. His fields were his wealth. Now the court threatened to take them. Mystery clung to the records. Entire bundles of writs vanished between county seats, as if someone had spirited them away. Judges whispered of petitions signed by hundreds, then hidden, the names withheld for fear of retaliation. Were they burned or tucked into some ledger that never surfaced again? The rebellion had been broken at Springfield, but the silence afterward felt heavier than musket fire. Governor Bowdoin, who had crushed the uprising with a private militia, walked out of office defeated, his name struck from ballots by men who once cheered him. In Boston's parlors, men in powdered wigs still drank Madeira from crystal goblets. In the countryside, families shared cornbread baked on stone, its crust sharp with ash. Which table held the truer reflection of liberty? In taverns, the talk grew hushed but bitter. Tankards scraped wood, tobacco smoke hung low, and words like tyranny returned to lips that had sworn never to speak them again. The rafters caught every syllable, keeping them long after the men stumbled home through snow. Out of this unrest came urgency, a republic that allowed veterans to march against its own courts could not survive by parchment alone. The articles had proven too thin. Power leaked through their gaps, like wind through unshuttered windows. Philadelphia was calling, doors closed, windows nailed, secrecy guarding the birth of something stronger. But could stronger chains also bind too tightly? Could a government with power to tax, to raise armies, to command commerce, turn on the very men it claimed to protect? The fields lay silent, brittle stalks rattling against the wind. Debt had turned victory into burden, and in that burden, the call for change grew louder than muskets. It lingered in the chamber long after the clerks had gone, the sharp sweetness of sealing wax, the iron tang of ink. Sheets of parchment lay stacked on the table, some signed, others waiting. The edges curled where heat from the fire had dried them too quickly. The air itself seemed heavy with decision. Outside, broadsides fluttered on tavern walls. Publius filled the presses with essays urging union. Hamilton's lines taught. Madison's reasoned. Jay's precise. The ink still smelled fresh, sharp enough to sting the nose when the sheets were pulled from the press. They were arguments meant to bind states like stitches across a wound. But for every page printed, another was torn down, unsigned, its words lost in alleys damp with rain. Luxury and doubt moved side by side. In New York, parlors glowed with candlelight. Ladies poured tea from porcelain painted in blue, and talk circled around the Constitution's promise of strength. Across the river, farmers in patched wool asked what rights the parchment had forgotten. Speech, worship, assembly. Could power claimed at the center be trusted not to crush them? Mystery lingers in the records. Some petitions survive, pages folded and refolded, the ink smudged by too many hands. Others vanished. Delegates spoke of letters written, then burned, names withheld, dissent hidden as carefully as gold. How many voices never reached the tally? How many arguments remain only in ash? The debates sharpened. One state ratified quickly, eager for order. Another resisted, its delegates sweating under wigs, arguing into the night while candles guttered low. Delaware, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Georgia, Connecticut, early affirmations. But Virginia trembled, New York resisted, Massachusetts demanded change. The parchment could not stand without promise, and so amendments were offered, 10 of them, rights written not as gift, but as guardrail. Imagine the air in those halls, wax dripping thick down brass candlesticks, quills scratching in fits and starts, words of compromise hanging heavy as smoke. A door open, letting in a draft sharp with the smell of rain-soaked streets, carrying the murmur of crowds who could not hear the debates, but waited all the same. By June 1788, 9 states had said yes. The Republic had its backbone at last. Yet the scent of wax and ink, heavy in those chambers, carried both victory and unease. For even as the parchment dried, men wondered, had they secured liberty or only shifted its boundaries? The candles burned low, the wax cooled into hardened pools on the table, shapes no one noticed. And the Republic, still fragile, carried its first constitution out into the night. Homespun itched against the skin. A farmer in Massachusetts pulled his coat tighter, the weave coarse, the seams patched with strips cut from an old blanket. His hands, cracked from winter soil, carried a ballot folded once, then twice. The parchment was smoother than his coat, softer beneath his thumb. In the cities, the fabric felt different. Delegates in Philadelphia wore velvet waistcoats lined with silk, their cuffs edged with lace. When they bent to dip quills, the cloth whispered faintly against polished wood. To the men who had marched barefoot in snow, such texture was a reminder. Liberty was being stitched together by hands wrapped in finer cloth than their own. The divide was not only felt, but seen. In taverns, mugs were pewter, dented and dark. In parlors, goblets of crystal caught the firelight, fragile and brilliant. Which spoke more of the Republic's future, the rough pewter that endured a fall, or the crystal that shattered at the smallest crack? Mystery deepened in the margins. Some state conventions ratified quickly, the votes stacked in neat columns, wax seals pressed firm. Others stalled, pages missing from the minutes, debates left half-recorded. Who decided what was copied into the official record and what was left out? A dissenting voice erased is still a voice once spoken. Where does it linger now? The Bill of Rights came as balm, written in ink, but felt like fabric, binding uneven seams. 10 articles, each a stitch meant to hold liberty together. Some thought the cloth now strong enough. Others feared the tear had only been hidden beneath embroidery. Imagine running your fingers over both. Rough wool that scratches, velvet that slides smooth. Which would you trust to wear in the storm? Which would last longer when pulled by too many hands at once? The Constitution had been ratified, but in its texture lay the tension of a country still uncertain which fabric would hold. Coffee boiled black in a pewter pot, its bitterness sharp against the tongue. In taverns across New York, the air was heavy with tobacco smoke and damp wool, the floor sticky with ale. Men leaned close, voices low, debating whether the Constitution ratified that summer of 1788 would steady the Republic or break it further. At the City Tavern in Philadelphia, delegates had toasted with Madeira only months before, the wine's sweetness masking the strain of compromise. Across the room, a man set down his glass too hard. The stem cracked, a line in crystal as fragile as the parchment still drying in Annapolis. History was moving quickly, yet uneasily. Delaware had ratified in December 1787, Pennsylvania days later. By June 1788, New Hampshire became the 9th state, tipping the scales. But New York trembled, its convention divided, streets thick with broadsides nailed to posts and torn down again by midnight. The taste of politics was as bitter as the coffee cooling in mugs. Mystery edged the debate. Some letters from anti-federalists vanished before reaching the press. Delegates spoke of arguments never recorded, speeches clipped short in official minutes. What was left unsaid? What was erased? Haunts, more than what survived. In Boston, candlelight spilled across Faneuil Hall, where men in powdered wigs argued into the night. The air smelled of sweat, wax, and wool. John Hancock, his health failing, shuffled in late, promising support if amendments. Later, the Bill of Rights were guaranteed. Outside, veterans in patched coats lingered on cobblestones slick with rain, their debts still unpaid, their faith wavering. Short sentences carried their truth. We fought. We bled. Now, we owe. Contrast sharpened everywhere. In Virginia, James Madison spoke calmly of federal balance, his notes neat, his voice patient. Patrick Henry thundered in reply, "Liberty is in danger," his words striking the rafters, echoing long after the candles guttered. One spoke with reason, the other with fire. Both left marks on parchment. The ratifications came, state by state. Connecticut, Georgia, New Jersey. Early, Massachusetts, Virginia, and New York, with hesitation, conditions, promises. In the end, 11 states stood together before Washington was called, but even then, uncertainty lingered. Could ink outlast hunger? Could parchment tame debt? The taste remained, bitter coffee on the tongue, sweet Madeira on the lips. 2 drinks, 1 republic, both uncertain. The The crowd leaned forward, but no one spoke. April 30th, 1789. The day the Republic tested its first breath. Washington stood on the balcony of Federal Hall in New York, the city restless below, the air tinged with salt from the harbor. His uniform, simple but precise, bore silver buttons polished until they caught the light like stars. A Bible was brought forward, gilt edges gleaming, its cover worn but dignified. Washington placed his hand upon it, the movement deliberate, steady, unadorned. Lace shawls fluttered from the balconies, silks brushed against stone as women leaned out for a glimpse. The hush was deeper than triumph. The words of the oath were plain, yet the silence that followed carried more weight than cannon fire ever had. Madeira had been poured in parlors, velvet chairs set in expectation, silver cups prepared for celebration. But in that moment, no toast mattered more than the stillness that wrapped itself around the city. Mystery remains, even here. Some swore Washington whispered an extra prayer. Others insisted he added words never copied into the record. The parchment of the oath lies in archives, its ink steady, but what lingered in the pause between lines will never be known. Luxury and fragility shared the same balcony. A general turned president, choosing duty over power. A republic barely formed, clothed in parchment and faith. The war was over. The treaties had been signed, the Constitution ratified. Yet survival was not written in fireworks, but in silence. In the bow of Washington's head, in the stillness of a crowd who had come to believe. So what have you learned by walking through these years of ash and parchment, of velvet and hunger? That America almost collapsed after it won. That ledgers burned, letters vanished, debts drove men to rebellion. That fragile luxuries, crystal, silk, gilt, stood beside ragged coats and empty fields. And that silence, more than shouts, shaped the birth of a nation. The ledger always carries forward, and so does the mystery. If this journey held you, let me ask, what would you have done in those years after Yorktown? Paid the debt, burned the ledger, or waited in silence? Tell me in the comments below. And if you wish to keep turning the pages of history with me, like this video and subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. Because the next video is already waiting. What new research reveals about Revolutionary War hunger? A chapter not of treaties or speeches, but of hunger. Fire cakes made of flour and water, soldiers chewing leather straps to quiet their stomachs. A war fought not only with muskets, but with empty bowls. Stay with me for that story. The ledger will open again.